Happy Monday, listeners. Welcome to the Religious Studies Project. I'm Dave McConaughey, and joining me today is Candace Mixon. Welcome, Candace.
Hi, Dave.
It is great to have you here. Normally, you are in firm control of our Twitter account, secretly behind the scenes, letting everyone know what the deal is, what the latest word is. But today, you were in the interviewer's seat. Can you tell everyone who's listening what they should be looking forward to in today's episode?
Sure. So, I talked with Richard McGregor about his new book, Islam and the Devotional Object, Seeing Religion in Egypt and Syria. And the main takeaway that we had in this conversation was that we looked at objects and we thought through material culture in ways that they resist easy categorization and easy sort of decoding. So, objects that push back, take us in unexpected directions. And we also get a little bit of methodology of how to maybe not go with a preconceived notion of what the object means, but follow its history, follow its biography, and see where it takes you. So I think that that's kind of the main tenor of the conversation. And within that, we talk a little bit about aesthetics and other methods in visual culture and religious studies more broadly.
Gosh, I can't wait. Can you tell me a little bit about what images that we're going to be hearing about?
Yeah, so we'll be hearing about some images and objects that are sort of not always studied within context of Islamic studies or religious studies or not thought about a ton. So some can include something called a mahmal that you'll hear mentioned. And so that's basically, you could think of it like a little tent or a little palanquin that goes on top of perhaps a camel in a processional way. And before, that used to be used to perhaps carry people or heads of state or something like that. But it takes this cool turn where it carries instead a processional object. So giving it this elevated status. And that object could be something like a kiswa, which is a fabric that wraps the Kaaba, which is in the center of Mecca and a part of the ritual Hajj in Islam. So that's one object that'll come up quite a bit. Another one that will come up is just the idea of processional or religious banners. These might go along with a procession, such as the Mahmal, sort of traveling through a city or traveling to Mecca. And the thing that we discuss a little bit related to these religious banners is that they also resist easy categorization because they're both ephemeral and they're difficult to kind of see and read on the fly. In a museum, when they're laid flat, or perhaps somewhere else, if you take an image, they're laid flat, and you can read them easily. But in their ritual practice and in their movement, they're very difficult to sort of discern. So we think about questions like that of movement, ephemerality, and then we get into some museum things as well.
I can't wait. Well, I hope the audience looks forward to our episode, Following the Objects, Seeing Religion in Egypt and Syria with Richard McGregor. Take it away.
All right. Well, I am here today on the Zoom universe with Dr. Richard McGregor, and welcome to the Religious Studies Project. Richard, how are you doing
Thank
today?
you. Thanks, Candace. Great to be here with you.
Good. Well, it's my extreme honor to have Richard here, mainly because he was my undergraduate advisor when I was but a young scholar of religion at Vanderbilt University, first completing the Islamic Studies minor at Vanderbilt. So definitely a formative mentor, which is really special to reconnect with. So he has a new book out, which is called Islam and the Devotional Object, Seeing Religion in Egypt and Syria, and it's out on Cambridge University Press this year. Prior to that, you did a critical Arabic edition and English translation with Len Goodman of The Case of the Animals versus Man Before the King of the Jinn. And your first book was Sanctity and Mysticism in Medieval Egypt, the Wafa Sufi Order and the Legacy of Ibn Arabi. So definitely wonderful trajectory of scholarship, but today we'll really focus in on this most recent book. Sounds good?
Great. Looking forward.
Awesome. So I was going to mention that in reading the introduction to this book, if I personally were teaching a theory and method in the study of religion course or something, kind of going over religious studies approaches and aesthetics, I could easily assign this chapter, this introduction. And I think I like it because it's a really good overview of the sort of messiness and theorists that we don't always pair together and think through together as an overview of these messy and incomplete tools. So you're bringing together Corbin, Eliade, Assad, McCutcheon, Geertz, Rancière, Kant, they're all coming into play here. And it's also able to see some contributions, in particular, potentiality of Islamic theories for religious studies theories. So I wondered if you could introduce us a bit to, why getting into the field of religion and aesthetics is helpful to introduce a book on Islamic devotional objects.
Right. Well, there has certainly been, I guess, from the widest lens, right? There's been a turn towards the image, you can say, maybe in the humanities, I guess, following the turn towards embodiment, right? So this sort of the inheritor of the linguistic turn, right, in the humanities, moving into embodiment, into questions around performativity, right, around the senses, around experiences, right, so somatic, haptic treatments of experience, right, within the humanities. These are deep and wide, right, evolving trends for us as humanists. So within the context of Islamic studies, right, that has been pushing us towards sort of finding, getting traction, right, finding a ground between what we would call, right, sort of history of ideas, right, the evolution of concepts, and that as the practice of Islam, right? Somewhere between that and the material culture, right? Material history, right? And the related practices around embodiment, right? And the senses. So we're still staking out, right, that territory, I think, in the study of Islam. Right? In the sort of comparative study of religion, right, we have had, we've made significant progress, turning towards visual culture, right, as the matrix, right, for the experience of religion. And people, I guess, like David Morgan, right, come up pretty quickly as important figures, right, for helping us as religionists find, right, that ground. So David Morgan underlining, right, religion as a visual practice, right, for Morgan. So, as we move forward to unpack, right, the material culture, Islamic notions of the sensory, right, Islamic notions, right, of the body, these are the ways that we move forward, right, with these concepts in the study of Islamic religion. So, yeah, so this project certainly follows along those lines, and part of the thread, really, right, part of the way forward, the thread that this book clings to and hopefully develops clearly enough all the way through, right, is sort of the thread of following the objects, well, first finding them, and I talk a bit about that, about how kind of magical it is to sort of find your object of study. Right? But finding and following the objects might be the most concise description of the methodology of this book. Why, right? I mean, and so what are the results? What does that method open up for us? Why not just do intellectual history? Why not just go and tell us what were they thinking in the, I don't know, Mamluk period, and what were they doing and thinking in the Ottoman period, right? And draw. Well, if we follow the objects, as it were, we end up telling a familiar but different story. Right? We end up talking about these well-known religious discourses. Right? We're talking poetry, Sufism, Islamic law, it's history, theology, right, etc. But we end up talking about those or engaging with those discourses historically in a rather different register, because we're following the object, right? To tell the story of the object, of the religious object, of the devotional object, like to tell that story fully is going to take us to some familiar languages, right? And ideas, concepts, debates within Islamic studies, right? But it will do it in a novel way, and it'll do it, and this is what was sort of surprising to me, to be honest. It'll do it. It will take us through them in new ways. But you think, well, I've kicked around, I don't know, Sufism for 20 years, or I'm a specialist in Kalam, but you're going to engage it by following the object. You shift your trajectory. Right? Because you're following the object. The object is marching through history, right? The object is marching through culture, right? It's making its way. Right? The object, the aesthetic, the image, right, is anchored, is negotiating, is moving through this as an Islamic object, right? And you're just sort of moving along with it to try to keep up and trying to tell its story. So yes, immediately you are very interdisciplinary. Right, you've got to be wear a lot of hats, right, to tell the story of the object as it moves.
And so I wonder, you mentioned in the intro to the book, you sort of brought up this idea that a lot of cultural historians have favored and used, and religious studies folks as well, of sort of object biographies, or the idea of the biography of an object. And I've called to mind, Richard Davis has done quite a few things on this related to Hinduism especially. And so I'm wondering, how do you think that it's a little different than maybe what you're thinking of following the object, than maybe doing an object's biography, or using that language of an object, or maybe how it's different within Islamic studies?
Right. So people who are working in this area, I've heard it from a few colleagues that they work in tension, and I mean that in sort of a negative way, with Islamic art history. Now that's not universal, but there is certainly sometimes a contested and defended line, right, between art history and, let's say, versions of the study of religion more widely, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
So here, the biography of the object, right, talking about histories, right, recalling the histories of objects, struggles in that contested space. The approach for this book was to anchor was to push more fully in the direction of what we would call aesthetics,
Mhm.
right? Aesthetics, the capacity, right, of images and objects to communicate to viewers, right, in ways that are not reducible, right, to language. I mean, that's sort of I think an acceptable current definition, right, of aesthetics, right, rather than aesthetics equals beauty.
Mhm.
That's really kind of past, right? So aesthetics transform for these more current purposes becomes the focus for telling the story of the object in this book. So what are the ways that we can engage, right, that nonverbal communication, right, that these objects and images are producing, that they trade in, that makes them what they are? Right? What are the ways? Well, it by definition can't be reduced to language, so it can't be reduced to a narrative, right? So we can't just say, oh, well, the provenance will tell us what it is. No, that's not what it's
Mhm.
saying, in scare quotes, right? As an aesthetic object or aesthetic phenomena. That is not what's being communicated, right, to the viewers or the devotees or the commentators or et cetera, right? These objects and images are communicating aesthetically. Now, how exactly does that work? Right? Well, that's a rather complicated picture, and there are sort of different approaches around getting at that. But the book is predicated, right, upon chasing down, right, that communication, that aesthetic communication that goes on. So how can we do that, right? If we're using language, if you and I are using language, right, and the objects and images are not using language, right?
Mhm.
Well, in that sense, we tell their story, right? So the history of the interaction with, right, the history of the evolution of the function, right, of an object. Um, those are the ways that we can get at what the object and image is saying, what it is communicating. And in the book, I frame it out by talking about objects that resist, right? Objects that resist reduction. So we will talk about the objects. Devotees will talk about the objects. They'll celebrate them. They'll write poetry about them. They'll yell at them. They'll right. And you and I will talk about what's Mamluk and what's, I don't know, what's Sufi and what's not, et cetera. Right? And all this talking will go on around the objects, right? But the object, in effect, will resist,
Mhm.
because none of us will say, oh, well, I've nailed it, right? I can speak for the aesthetic communication. You can't. No one can, right? No one can, by definition. That's so. But what can we do, right? We can the objects will resist discursive reduction, but that doesn't mean that they're not communicating. How can we get at that communication? Well, there's lots of information. Right?
Yeah.
There's lots. It's saying many things in many places to many people. Now you and I have to go out as scholars and just do the spade work, right? And just follow and dig, right? And pull all of that together and pull together, right? And sort of map out, right, in a way, or mirror somehow, right, the aesthetic communication.
So I wonder, with that, I was thinking of resistance, and I love in various places in the book it comes up that the objects are resisting, or the or something along those lines, or that the objects are exuberant, or the objects are offensive, or whatever it might be, or deface. And so I love that kind of both agency and just in pivoting there. So I'm kind of ruminating over that. But in the meantime, speaking of resisting categories, there's often been, and I've myself have talked about this previously in the Religious Studies Project, the insistence on trying to police categories of images within Islamic arts that include a sort of, maybe I think you would agree, a false kind of category of, the figurative and the non-figurative, right? That the figurative communicates something that is meant to be decoded or understood, and the abstract, or the beauty of calligraphy, or the beauty of an arabesque design, or something along those lines, evades that. It's too abstract. So I wonder if you could say a little bit, because you also push back against that kind of that position, I guess, of let's separate these two things out. And I wonder, if you have connections to aesthetic theory there, to maybe help us not make that binary so stark.
Right. Yeah. So I have a chapter devoted to inscriptions,
Mm-hmm.
and the sort of object at hand, right, is banners,
Mm-hmm.
religious banners, which the more I follow that object, the more slippery and strange and challenging and curious it became as an object. Right? Looking closer did not bring it into better focus. Right? Scrutinizing the banner made it kind of bewilderingly evasive. Right. So the question, and banners and inscriptions are wonderful things, right? Because of course they are discursive statements, while also being carrying, right, an aesthetic communication, right? So how an inscription is made, right? Communicates, right, brings along with it, right, all kinds of aesthetic. There's an important aesthetic dimension that's mobilized, right, with inscriptions. Right? Religious banners became very quickly, to my eye, right, a fascinating object to study, and one of the most sort of exciting parts of the phenomena of banners and how they communicate is kind of sort of a technical thing, but it's that banners are texts that, I argue in the chapter, are not really meant to be read in the normal sense that you and I as moderns think about reading.
Yeah.
Right? But they are writing, right? And they must be writing. They can't be pseudo writing to function,
Mm-hmm.
right? But they're not there to be read in that sense of simply decoding the text. They are there to be seen, right? They are there to be glimpsed, and banners are to be carried by bodies, right, through space. That's a banner at its fullest expression, right? Is when it's waving in the wind and the camels and the kids are yelling and the whatevers are marching along with the banner. So we say, well, what is the aesthetic communication, right, of that script? Well, it's huge, right? It's firing on several different levels simultaneously, right? And communicating aesthetically, right, as part of this devotional practice. So that chapter was to identify the object, which took a long time, and then to follow through and untangle some of the depth, right, of the various registers that are at play around the devotional use of banners.
Yeah, awesome. So, thinking through the chapters as well, you kind of bring up objects that maybe other people resist as well, that are uncomfortable with, like reformers or people that would say no to such banners or such things that maybe are deemed as unessential to the practice of Islam. And so I think it's at the end of your intro, you mentioned that we can move away from analyses of religion that overstate the determining role of ideas and conceptual models in the history of Islamic practice. And that, often legal reflections and theological discourses and whatnot are perhaps giving too much weight of creating the idea of the object or the meaning of it. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about it, because I really liked that idea and thinking through the limits of that over determination by people that ascribe meaning to such things.
That was particularly useful to me as a religionist, right? Because it was sort of shocking for me to see how some of these very central, very important practices, right, could change. Right? And in the case of the mahmal, right, for the Hajj, the large palanquin that was paraded and went on the Hajj, was discontinued as a practice. It was a central Islamic practice in Egypt and other centers for 700 years. 700 years, right? And then it stops. As a religionist, I'm like, wait a minute, religion, important key phenomena don't stop. I mean, by definition, they're, I don't know what, right? I mean, the tradition tells you why we have certain rights and why we have certain beliefs, and these things are not negotiable, and they're not, right? And they don't come and go, and that's not part of the message of Muhammad or whatever, right? Of the revealed religion. That it, well, how can these things, right? And as a religionist, right, it's a window of conceptual opening, right? To say, of course it does, right? Of course, that's what the history of religions is all about. The history of religions is that religion, in fact, does change, right? And it changes dramatically over time, right? Although in its voice, religion, capital R, right, never changes. It never changes. It's universal, but the history of religions, it's nothing but change. So following objects we can bump up into some of these transition periods, right? Rather dramatically, right? And forces us to turn back and to reflect and to be a bit smarter, right? And more aware around issues of the evolution of ritual, right? The evolution of visual culture, the evolution of devotional practices, right? Debates about licit practices, right? The impact of modernity, right? The impact of empire, whether it be pre-modern or contemporary empire, right? And the political machinations and changes that are going on. Sure, yes, they affect religious practice, right? And important religious concepts. Right? So the mahmal was a wonderful object to follow in its evolution, right? In its rise, and the very, very central and important roles that it played as part of the Hajj. It was a key component of what the Hajj was, right? For Egyptians and other various other regions, the mahmal was an important part of that visual, right, and religious culture. It evolved, and we have this dramatic denouement, right, in 1953. We have the debates, we have the rise of sort of pro-Wahhabi, Salafist-inspired criticism that goes on in Egypt for sort of 100 years. around the mahmal, and the mahmal changes, and some of the rituals change around it over that 100 years, and the debates go on, and right, Al-Azhar is saying this, and then others are saying that, and then the politicians are wading in, right, right, and then the last chapter, the last end of that story is right the end of the mahmal. Well, and the end of the mahmal, that chapter of the mahmal's life, right? Because to chase down the object, right, takes us from the public square, right, where people would gather to celebrate the Hajj, right? With the end of the mahmal, takes us to where? To the museum.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about welcome to the modern period, right? Because it's a museum, right? So the whole idea of what is a museum? What's its a very modern, and in this case, a colonial, literally a colonial imposition, right? Parachuted right into Egypt, right? Which and the museum becomes the next space for the mahmal, right? So, right, it's these religious rites are shifting, right? These sensibilities are shifting, and then the object is going to find itself right in this new environment, and it becomes an ethnographic object, or it becomes a sort of high art, it becomes Arab art, right? An example of Arab art all of a sudden, and then it's going to have its career right as an object within those discourses, and in with those spaces. But also, again, on this idea of sort of chasing the object, was this, like I say, right, following the objects takes you to sometimes these strange places. It forced me to make the connection and to take seriously this connection between Hajj rituals and shrines. And I have worked on both previously, and not connected them really. But this visual culture, this material culture story made these obvious connections. And there was clearly this overlap, and I call it in the book the scattering of the mahmal, right? So the mahmal as an object in its widest sense sort of scatters. And what I'm trying to get at there is to account for the taking up of what we could call, for our purposes, mahmal practices in and around shrines, right? and right, saintly based shrines. So the funerary rituals and the use of funerary coverings, right? Again, inscriptions. And this practice of parading with a shrine mahmal, right, in Egypt, the more I looked, right, the more I would find of these sort of mini versions of the Hajj mahmal, but they were based on saint shrines throughout Egypt. So Delta, Upper Egypt, etc. The Mamluk, even, pretty quickly we go back into the sources in Ottoman, and we just don't have sources in fine-grained material. But I'm curious to imagine how far back this goes. But anyways, in the chapter I talk about the scattering of the mahmal, and these mahmal practices sort of take root throughout Egypt, but they're not called Hajj rites anymore at that point. They're called Mulid rites, or the love of Ahlul Bayt shrines, and we've always paraded Sidi so and so's, the covering of Saint so and so's shrine. We put it on the back of a camel, and it's pointed like at the mahmal, and we go on around the town, and we stop at the various places, just like the mahmal in Cairo. But we have these sort of small regional versions of it. So how do we think about that? How do we make sense of this practice? Well, methodologically, right, this was the opening. It forced right, these connections to be made, right, at least for this chapter, right? What happened to the mahmal when well, in a sense, the mahmal scattered out through the landscape.
Yeah.
Right? And the mahmal idea and image and form and object lives. It lives on, but it lives on in this, right? In yet another, right, interesting and rather discreetly different chapter, right, of its life.
Even wall art or something, or just paintings on the sides of buildings and things like that, just different formations of the same object. So to kind of pivot back and maybe get ready to close us up shortly, I wondered, just sort of thinking back to, you sort of mentioned your place as a religionist and a religious studies theorist. And so I wonder if you could just kind of bring us back to how this type of inquiry, thinking through, following through the objects, if there's anything specific related to Islamic studies that can kind of speak back to or inform conversations that we're having in religious studies, anxieties that we have in religious studies about the collapsing of departments and fields and things like that, and just what that interplay is between what you've learned over so many years of studying Islam and being in the field of religious studies, and how those work together, maybe.
Well, sure. I mean, as religionists, right? You and I, we straddle. We have a foot in the we can call it area studies camp, right? And then we're also religionists, right? Mm-hmm. So we are thinking, right, these big questions about the nature of the study of religion. Mm-hmm. And is there even an object for the study of religion? And insider, outsider. Is that, are we still talking about that? And right, and what is the study of religion, and what is theological thinking, right? And what can we engage with tradition, with religious traditions, right? And how can we do that in constructive, right, and stimulating and rigorous ways, right? Mm-hmm. And well, I am heartened by when I see the research trajectories opening up amongst especially young scholars, right, in the study of Islamic tradition, right, around these very rich, right, discourses, ongoing discourses, right, across the humanities, right? These can and should be mined, right, by us as Islamicists. Right? Yes, of course, obviously we need to be Islamicists and strong and right and careful in our work, right? But we are also humanists. Right. And we're religionists, so we draw on these rich, ongoing, stimulating discourses around us. Right. So issues around, around gender. Right. Issues around embodiment. Right. And image. And pushing, pushing more directly around ethics, right? And ethics as a critical and comparative category, right, rather than simply a received theological, is sort of a rich, exciting, emerging field. Yeah. There are some interesting things around in textual studies. I'm actually launching out into a project on ritual, on Islamic ritual, and it is.
And is that what you'll be doing? I wanted to also give you time to kind of mention your next thing. So is that what you'll be going back to Cairo for?
Actually, I'll be. I'm going to Cairo on a more focused project, which is an exploration of the bodily engagements with devotional texts.
Awesome.
Think marginalia, right? Mm-hmm. Think the sort of devotional rubbings, right, mm-hmm. of texts, tearing, tears, all of these sort of visceral engagements with devotional text. Well, in the age of COVID, right, and the digital age, right, where we can do everything online, apparently, this project is a terrible idea. I mean, it's a wonderful idea, but it's a terrible idea because it means you have to go. You have to go and physically encounter these objects, right, up close and personal.
Yeah, and no one should be touching shrines right now, but nonetheless, you got to figure it out. So thank you for that. And then just briefly, is that part of something else related to ritual that you mentioned? Another project on ritual?
Right. So the project on ritual is it's wider, and what the project is doing is ritual itself, right, is I think literally a gigantic field, right? I mean, it's been it's been worked on intensively for, I don't know, 100 years. I mean, 120 years. So yes, you could easily quickly drown in it, and we don't want to do that. But we're talking about sort of emerging trajectories in Islamic studies, and I'm going to argue that there are a number that will come out of the study of good old ritual, because the study of ritual phenomena will bring to bear many of these emerging, evolving methodologies and critical conversations. Yes, anchored in ritual phenomena, right? But not in this old reductive sense of decoding and then trying to define what are the boundaries of ritual. That's pretty far past us. But ritual phenomena, right, are still a puzzle. They're still very puzzling, right, and very central, right, to religious practice. So this is sort of be the next chapter in that, right? So what are some of the most exciting ways that we can get traction on this material in the study of Islam?
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. This is great. I've learned a ton, thought through a few more things. I taught one of the chapters of the books in my material religion class, but hopefully I'll be teaching it again next year. And I look forward to thinking through this a bit more with this information in mind. So thank you so much.
Very good. Thanks very much, Candace. It's a pleasure to spend some time with you.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Candace, for that great interview. I really enjoyed learning about the mahmal and the religious banners and the way that we should be thinking a lot more broadly about how religious people interact with religious objects and the lives that they have that are so dynamic. If you are listening to this episode today, we would love your support for the work that we do. If you'd like to give a monthly donation, we encourage you to head over to patreon.com/projectrs, where you can give us a monthly donation. Maybe just a cup of coffee a month would really help us support the work that we do. If that's not your thing, there's plenty of other ways to help. If you visit our website at religiousstudiesproject.com, you can actually shop on Amazon, buy all of your normal things, and we get a cut of the wonderful things that you buy. So whether it's books or toys or whatever it is, we would love it if you think of us when you shop and use that opportunity to support the Religious Studies Project. As always, we thank you for your time and appreciate your support. Thanks for listening.
The RSP is sponsored by the BASR, NAASR and the IAHR and is produced by the Religious Studies Project Association, a Scottish charitable incorporated organisation. Find out more at religiousstudiesproject.com.
Brought to you by editors Brianne Fallon and David McConaughey, and founding editors Chris Cotter, that's me, and David Robertson, that's the other guy. Our features are edited by Rebecca Barrett-Fox and Lauren Osborne, and our Opportunities Digest by Ella Bach. Audio editing by Alex Matthews, podcast transcription by Andy Alexander and Savannah Finver, and social media managed by Ray Radford and Candace Mixon.
Don't forget you can support the project by using our Amazon affiliate links or donating at patreon.com/projectrs. And you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, iTunes, and other portals. Thanks for listening.